battle is brewing over the future of Kilvey Hill. Have you heard about this one?
Oh, yeah. Kilvey Hill. It's been all over the news here. It's a fascinating case study in those tensions between progress and trying to preserve something special. With the potential impact on this cherished landscape, this really affects the community's sense of place, you know?
Yeah, it's that classic dilemma. A lot of cities are grappling with this all over the world,
Sure.
and it's something we're going to tackle head on today. So we've got a stack of sources here, planning documents, environmental assessments, and even transcripts from that fiery planning committee meeting where they actually made the decision,
Oh, wow. So we're going right into the heart of the action.
right into the thick of it.
Love it.
So to set the scene, we're talking about a proposal by Skyline Enterprises. They're a New Zealand-based company known for these adventure parks, and they wanted to transform Kilvey Hill.
Yeah, I've seen some of their other projects. They're not exactly known for their subtlety.
Uh-huh. Let's just say the community is not exactly unified on this one.
I bet. What kind of pushback are we talking about?
Well, get this. 545 objections filed with the council, compared to just 40 letters of support.
Whoa. Okay, so that's a pretty clear indication of how strongly people feel about this. You don't see numbers like that very often.
It's a landslide of opposition. And when you actually read through those objections, you start to understand why.
What are some of the main concerns that people are raising?
Development, all the noise, the traffic, is going to destroy that peaceful atmosphere.
Right. It's like that saying, if you build it, they will come. But in this case, maybe it's more like, if you build it, the peace will go.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about a little bit of background noise. The gondola is supposed to run until midnight. Imagine that.
Until midnight. Wow. That's pretty late,
I
especially
know.
if you live nearby.
Yeah, and then there's the construction itself. All the noise, all the disruption.
Mm.
Plus there's talk of potential amplified music at the luge run.
Oh, wow. So it's not just the development itself, it's the ripple effects, too.
Exactly.
In Wales, there are certain areas that are officially recognized for how quiet they are, for their tranquility.
Yeah.
And they're protected under these noise regulations.
So to be one of these quiet areas, like what does it have to do? What does it have to be like?
To maintain that status, 75% of Kilvey Hill has to have noise levels that are below 65 decibels.
65 decibels.
Yeah. Think of it like the hum of a refrigerator.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And what happens if it gets louder than that?
Then the whole area has to be looked at again. And it could, it could potentially lose that quiet area designation.
Okay, so that brings us to the big thing, the elephant in the room. Luge tracks and a food hall, and they're saying they want to attract hundreds of thousands of visitors every year.
Every year.
Of course, the developers are talking about job creation and economic benefits.
Yeah.
But you can't just ignore the concerns. It's not just another hill, is it?
Exactly. Kilvey Hill holds a special designation. It's a quiet area, a peaceful haven protected under Welsh Government guidelines. And this is where it gets really interesting, the 75% rule.
Ooh, the 75% rule.
Mhm.
Sounds ominous. Break it down for us. What's that all about?
So to maintain its quiet area status, 75% of Kilvey Hill must have noise levels below 65 decibels. Think of it like a sound budget. They can only spend so much noise before it jeopardizes the area's peacefulness.
Interesting. So it's not just about eliminating all noise, but keeping it within a specific limit across most of the hill. Okay, so that's the rule.
Mhm.
But how does that actually play out in real life? Are there other quiet areas in Swansea? What's allowed in those places?
Good question. Think of Fendrad Lake, another quiet area in Swansea. You can stroll around, have a picnic, enjoy some bird watching, all very low-key activities. These designations are all about preserving tranquil spaces, especially in urban areas for people's well-being and enjoyment. The contrast between those areas and what Skyline Swansea wants to build is stark, to say the least.
Yeah, from tranquil birdwatching to a sky swing, that's quite a jump. And I remember a quote from the local Access Forum describing Kilvey Hill as this peaceful haven, a place where people go for quiet enjoyment for their mental and physical health. So naturally, there's this fear that the development could completely change the atmosphere.
Absolutely. And that's the heart of the controversy. The concern is that all those attractions, the zip lines, the luge, the crowds, the music, will create a noise overload and push a significant portion of Kilvey Hill over that crucial 65 decibel limit, violating the 75% rule. We've got to unpack this noise issue because it's clearly a big one.
Okay, so let's talk noise. What are people actually saying about the potential noise pollution from Skyline Swansea?
Well, one resident, Ben Houghton, has been meticulously documenting everything. He's flagged potential noise violations from all sorts of sources. The luge track, the sky swing, even that proposed open-top bar. His argument is that the official noise assessments mainly focus on nearby homes, not the quiet heart of Kilvey Hill, where the ambient noise has always been much lower.
So it's not just the decibel level, but also where that noise is concentrated.
Exactly. And then there's the cumulative effect. One attraction might be okay on its own, but add in the gondola, the zip lines, the crowds, the amplified music, it all adds up. It's that combined impact that could push a big chunk of Kilvey Hill over that 65 decibel limit and blow their sound budget.
Right, it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts, but with noise. It all adds up. I did notice something interesting in the Planning Committee meeting minutes. Councillor Downing brought up a concern about the gondolas passing over the road and whether the noise would distract drivers.
That's a great point. It shows that noise assessments need to consider the bigger picture. How does the development fit in with the existing environment? What will the impact be on different people and activities? To a 2022 noise pollution map
Which showed only a small area,
of the designated quiet area.
still meeting that unique standard
He even said noise was creeping in
from outside the edges of the woodland.
and that it hadn't been properly tested.
So, what was the council's response?
Well, the planning officer's report does acknowledge,
That Kilvey Hill is within a designated quiet area.
and they quote the policy,
That no development should cause an unacceptable noise increase.
but they also say that the noise studies
Predicts some increases in sound.
around the attraction sites.
The loose tracks, the gondola, the sky swing,
But they emphasize that Kilvey Hill is large.
and that certain areas will still experience similar noise levels.
Basically, their argument is that not every inch,
Of the quiet area needs to remain silent,
and that the development still accords with noise policies.
even though the tranquility will be altered in parts.
They're saying it doesn't reach that bar of unacceptable impact.
So it seems like the council acknowledged the quiet area status,
But they felt the development could still be compatible.
even with some noise increases.
Swansea Council,
Hasn't followed the Welsh Government's guidelines.
regarding noise assessment,
He says the noise assessment is incomplete,
and not independent.
which is critical given Kilvey Hill's protected status.
Now, according to the transcript,
But the council is wrong.
by accepting any harm to the quiet area.
The policy sets a high bar of no unacceptable impact.
But that planning report admits
There would be some harm to the quiet area.
the council is basically saying, we judged it acceptable.
But you're right, you're pointing out,
They're not explaining how they reached that conclusion.
without explicit reference to Welsh Government.
Exactly.
Right, and then there are those conditions.
Right, but like we talked about, even with those measures,
I'm still hung up on that.
and they didn't consult properly with the noise action plan.
Right, so you're saying that the response was insufficient.
It's a matter of them being out of compliance.
With the Welsh Government's noise action plan,
To be frank with you, the document doesn't specify.
if the Welsh Government was consulted,
Yeah, it does make you wonder about how transparent.
it almost feels like they're saying there is no noise level set,
On Kilvey Hill.
and then you want to know how the council is responding?
Okay, so you are saying that they don't acknowledge it.
And the Welsh Government wants people to be consulted,
So you want us to tell you about the Welsh Government plan.
and how the Welsh Government should be consulted.
Okay, right to point out the seeming disconnect.
Between that 65 decibel threshold and the council's response.
The council didn't explicitly say we're ignoring it.
But, according to the objectors, they didn't address the core issue.
As you pointed out, they didn't acknowledge the patchwork of needs.
Yeah, Houghton argued the council failed to properly evaluate,
The soundscape and health impacts of losing that quiet space.
and how the environmental noise regulations tie in,
It's like they sidestepped that specific regulation.
by saying there are no fixed noise limits,
Right, they emphasized Kilvey Hill's size.
and that not every inch needs to be perfectly quiet.
Those guidelines designed for quiet preservation.
One could argue they misapplied the policy.
They even say that the noise impacts are going to be localized.
But it sounds like for a lot of residents, those reassurances just aren't enough.
It's easy to see why people might be skeptical.
Yeah, and this whole thing is kind of complicated by the fact that Councillor Rob Stewart, the council leader, he was very publicly in favor of this Skyline project from the very beginning.
Oh, really? So
Wait.
right from the get-go.
Yeah, and that raised some red flags for a lot of people. You know, they started to worry that his position of power might have influenced the decision-making process.
I see what you mean. Even if it was unintentional, that perception of bias can really damage public trust.
It's like that saying, justice must not only be done, it must also be seen to be done.
Exactly. It raises that question, right? Like, did the council thoroughly think about this potential noise impact and their legal obligations before giving this project the green light? It's a valid concern.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
Speaking of planning, let's take a closer look at that Welsh Government document on quiet areas.
Okay, yeah.
Document WG 12523. It gives us a lot of insight into how these designations actually work
Mm-hmm.
and why they're so important.
Yeah. And what I find fascinating about this document, it goes beyond just measuring the noise.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about tranquility as a broader idea,
Right.
encompassing the soundscape, the presence of nature, even how a place looks.
Mm.
It recognizes that there's something special about those, those pockets of calm,
Yeah.
especially in our world that's becoming increasingly busy and hectic.
It is, isn't it? And that philosophy seems to be at the heart of a lot of these objections.
It does, yeah.
They're not just worried about loud noises. They're worried about a fundamental shift in the character of Kilvey Hill,
Mm-hmm.
a place they value for its peacefulness and its natural beauty.
Exactly. They're worried about losing those qualities that make the hill a place to escape. A place to connect with nature, a place that's different from all the hustle and bustle of city life.
Yeah, a place to just breathe.
Mm.
And it's a good reminder that we're not just talking about these abstract ideas.
Yeah.
We're talking about people's lives, their homes, their connection to a specific place.
And that brings us back to, that question of who benefits and who ends up carrying the costs.
Yeah. Some objectors argue that all those exciting activities, the luge runs, the zip line, even just the crowds themselves, they're all going to create noise.
Yeah.
And potentially a lot of noise.
A lot of noise.
And that could violate the Welsh Government guidelines on noise levels in quiet areas.
Exactly. And these guidelines, they're not just arbitrary rules. They exist for a reason.
Yeah.
Document WG 12523 specifically states that at least 75% of a quiet area has to maintain noise levels below 65 decibels.
Okay.
And there are potential legal, even financial risks for the council if they approve a project that doesn't meet these standards.
That's a really good point. It's not just a hypothetical concern either. We found one objector, Ben Houghton, who actually filed a formal complaint about potential noise violations.
Oh, wow.
He pointed to existing noise reports. He's arguing that even those suggest a real risk of going over, exceeding those permissible noise limits. Distraction's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to exclude a lot of residents, especially, those from areas that are already deprived.
And that's crucial, because accessibility, it goes beyond just physical access.
Right.
It's about making sure everyone feels welcome, making sure they can participate.
Yeah.
Regardless of, their income, their ability.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of sustainability,
right.
long term.
Yeah, Chris Lewis, he was skeptical about Swansea's history with those failed attractions.
Yeah, he had a point.
And it brings up a valid concern. Is this project a bit of a gamble with limited benefit for the locals?
Yeah.
Are there other, maybe alternative approaches to economic development that are more sustainable?
Right.
That could achieve similar goals but without, all the risks and disruption?
It's worth considering, for sure. I mean, we've all seen those big projects.
We have.
They promise the world, but then they just, they become these abandoned, eyesores.
Yeah.
Real testament to short-sighted planning. They are. Not the only worry. People are also raising concerns about traffic jams, potential damage to water supplies, and loss of natural habitat. It's clearly about more than just decibels at this point.
Absolutely. And this is where understanding the legal and policy frameworks in Wales comes in. You've got the environmental noise regulations of 2006, which are all about protecting quiet areas. Then there's WG 12523, which lays out the specific rules for those designations. And on top of that, you have the Swansea Local Development Plan, which clearly states that development shouldn't have a negative impact on existing quiet areas.
So there's a whole web of regulations in place to protect places like Kilvey Hill. But as we're seeing, actually enforcing those rules and making sure development plays by the rules can be pretty complicated.
It certainly can. And it's not just about following the letter of the law. The process also needs to be fair and transparent so the community feels like their concerns are being taken seriously.
And I think that's where some of the real frustration comes in. Reading through those meeting transcripts and complaints, you can sense this feeling that some residents feel like they weren't listened to, like the decision was already made before they even had a chance to voice their concerns.
That comes through loud and clear. For example, Jane Britton's testimony at the Planning Committee meeting is incredibly powerful. She spoke about her fears of the development damaging her private water supply and the emotional toll the whole situation has taken on her. It's a stark reminder that this isn't just some abstract policy debate. It has real consequences for people's lives.
Right. It puts a human face on the whole controversy. This isn't just about decibels and regulations. It's about people's homes, their well-being, their peace of mind. And speaking of feeling unheard, we need to talk about those calls for deferral. There was a real push to hit the pause button on this whole project.
Yes. Several people, including some counselors, urged the committee to slow down. They argued that more assessments were needed, especially regarding noise, and that the public consultation process needed to be more robust. They wanted to make sure all concerns were heard and addressed, not just brushed aside.
And there were some strong arguments made. Councillor Hale, for instance, was quite skeptical about the project's financial sustainability. He even called it a potential white elephant, suggesting it might not deliver the economic benefits promised, and could even end up being a financial burden.
That's a powerful term to use, and it really resonated with some people. It taps into a broader concern about unsustainable development projects that look good on paper but end up being costly mistakes. He was also worried about the impact on local infrastructure, things like traffic gridlock and strain on public services.
So Councillor Hale was hitting the brakes, but we know there was a counterargument. Councillor Stewart was a vocal supporter of the project. He saw the economic potential as outweighing the risks.
Yes.
But there are also a lot of really valid and specific concerns. For example, we have Martin Britton. He's done this super detailed analysis that suggests that the developers might have seriously underestimated the impact on traffic, like by a lot.
Oh, no.
He says it could be as much as 28% higher than they're projecting. Can you imagine the traffic on roads like Pentragon Road, especially during tourist season?
Yeah, I mean, that's already a busy road.
Exactly. So that's a big red flag right there.
It is. Increased traffic is a huge concern for any big development, and it sounds like this one could be much worse than they're letting on. What other things are people worried about?
Another big one is water contamination. A lot of residents in the area rely on private water supplies, like boreholes and springs, and they're terrified that the construction and the runoff from the development could pollute their water.
Yeah, I can understand that fear. Having clean water is essential, and if you're relying on a private source, it makes you even more vulnerable.
Exactly. And remember Jane Britton, who lives closest to the site.
Yeah.
Well, her property wasn't even included in the hydrological report.
Oh.
And she's completely dependent on a private well for her water. So you can see why she's so worried. And she's not alone. A lot of people are calling for more thorough testing of all the boreholes in the area just to be safe.
It sounds like there's a lot of anxiety around this issue.
Oh, yeah.
Is it just the technical side of things that's causing concern, or is there something more to it? So some residents get their water from these private wells, and they're worried that the construction, the digging and blasting for the gondola and the luge tracks could contaminate the water.
So their water could be at risk.
Yeah.
What have the developer said about that?
Ben is arguing that the assessment they did for the water wasn't good enough. It didn't really look at the risks to these wells, and there's no promise that they'll test the water regularly to make sure it's safe.
So they just have to hope for the best. That doesn't seem fair.
Yeah, that seems to be the situation. And the fact that there's no protection for those people who rely on those wells is a big problem. It shows a bigger issue with these big developments. Who takes the risks and who gets the benefits?
That's a really good point. Okay, let's move on to public access. The developers are promising enhanced access with new trails and bridleways. But a lot of locals don't seem to believe it. What's the real story here?
So Kilvey Hill, like we said, has all these paths. Some are official, some aren't. The official ones, the public rights of way, those are protected by law. But the informal ones, the ones that people have been using for years and years, they're more vulnerable.
It's a massive change.
Yeah.
And for people who see Kilvey Hill as this defining feature of their city, it's a tough pill to swallow.
Absolutely. It's like taking a piece of their identity away.
And then you've got the environmental concerns. This isn't just about losing a few trees. We're talking about clearing a significant amount of woodland and grassland to make way for all these attractions.
Yeah, and remember, this is impacting the entire ecosystem of the hill. There's a site of importance for nature conservation right there, and people are worried about what's going to happen to protected species.
Well, there's a common thread that I've noticed in a lot of the objections. It's this feeling that the whole consultation process has been really inadequate, almost like they're being ignored. Residents feel like they haven't had a real chance to share their concerns and that nobody's listening to their objections.
You know, for a project of this scale, it seems like having a transparent and inclusive consultation process would be crucial to build trust and address people's concerns.
Absolutely. One resident, Dr. Christine Dobbs, went so far as to do her own independent community survey.
Wow.
And guess what? The results showed overwhelming concern about the development.
So it's clear that there's this real disconnect between the community and the council.
It seems that way, yeah.
Wow. Okay, so it sounds like we have a really complicated situation here. We've got economic promises clashing with environmental and social anxieties, and a community that feels like it's being left out of the conversation. This Skyline Swansea development is turning into a real battleground.
Yeah, it definitely is. And honestly, we've only just scratched the surface of this story.
We've been digging into all these documents about this Skyline Swansea proposal, and it's really striking how much of this goes beyond just dollars and cents or even decibel levels. There's this whole human side to this story that we can't ignore.
Oh, absolutely. As we're going through these documents, it's the personal experiences and the anxieties of the people who live there that really jump out at you. These aren't just abstract arguments, they're real people's lives we're talking about.
Yeah, and like Jane Britton, who we talked about earlier, the one who lives right next to the development site. Her emails and even her testimony at the planning committee meeting, they paint this picture of someone who feels like she's been completely ignored, even disrespected by the whole process.
Yeah, it's understandable why she feels that way.
Yeah.
She talks about being excluded from all these important meetings like the stakeholder meetings, the neighbor consultation, even the assessments that directly affect her property and her water supply,
Mm,
like the noise and hydrological reports. I mean, wouldn't you feel a bit left out?
absolutely. It's like her concerns, the things that matter most to her well being, were just brushed aside. And it sounds like that feeling is pretty widespread in the community.
It really is. Dr. Dobbs, the one who conducted that independent survey, she brought up that same feeling that residents feel unheard and disregarded.
Yeah.
It points to this sense of a power imbalance between the community and the people who are making these decisions that affect their lives.
So it's bigger than just the specifics of the project, like how loud the rides will be or how much traffic there will be. It's about whether people feel like their voices matter, whether there's any real two-way communication happening.
That lack of trust, it can be so damaging, especially when you're talking about something that could permanently change communities' landscape and character.
Exactly. If you don't feel like you're being listened to, why would you trust any of the promises they're making?
Right.
It makes sense that people would be skeptical.
It does. And if we kind of zoom out a bit, I think this situation raises some really important questions about public consultation in general. Like, how do we make sure these big development decisions actually reflect the needs and the values of the people they affect? How do we build real trust and make sure everyone has a seat at the table?
Those are some big questions, but they seem to be at the heart of this whole debate.
They do.
So, where do we go from here?
How we make decisions about development.
Absolutely. And one of those questions that you seem particularly interested in is the issue of transparency and trust in the planning process.
Yes. Because even if we put the economic arguments and the environmental concerns aside for a moment, there's this underlying question of whether the process itself was fair and transparent. And from what we've seen in these documents, there are definitely some cracks in that foundation. You're right, there are definitely some red flags when it comes to transparency. For example, Ben Houghton, in his call-in request to the Welsh ministers, claims that some crucial objections and evidence were simply left out of the official planning records. He feels like the council was trying to sweep those concerns under the rug.
And that's a serious accusation. If true, it raises questions about whether the council was genuinely committed to a fair and open process, or whether they were more interested in pushing the project through, regardless of community concerns.
Exactly. And it's not just Ben Houghton. Remember that email exchange we saw where a council representative said a public meeting would be inappropriate at this point in time? It gives the impression that they were trying to avoid a real dialogue with the community.
That's a worrying sign. Public consultation is supposed to be a way for residents to have a meaningful say in shaping their community, not just a box-ticking exercise. When people feel like their voices aren't being heard, it erodes trust and can lead to even more resistance.
It's like they're playing a game with the rules rigged against the residents. And it's not just about this one project. If people lose faith in the planning process, it can have ripple effects throughout the whole community.
Absolutely. It creates a sense of powerlessness and cynicism that can be very difficult to overcome. It's essential to have robust legal frameworks, independent oversight, and a genuine commitment to community engagement if we want to build trust and make sure development decisions are made fairly.
So where does this leave us? We've got a project with big economic promises, serious environmental concerns, and now these questions about whether the process was even fair to begin with. It feels like a tangled mess.
It is a complex situation, but what strikes me is that even with all these challenges, there's still a chance for a positive outcome. Ben Houghton's call-in request to the Welsh ministers is a good example. He's not giving up. He's using the system to hold the council accountable and demand a more thorough review.
He's like David going up against Goliath. It's inspiring to see someone fighting so hard for what they believe in.
His persistence is commendable. And his arguments raise some important points. Did the council adequately assess the potential impact on the quiet area? Did they properly consider alternative options or mitigation measures? Were they truly transparent and responsive to community concerns? These are all valid questions that deserve answers.
Okay, so maybe there's still hope for a different outcome, for a solution that addresses both the economic needs of the city and the concerns of the residents. But how do we even begin to untangle this mess and find that balance?
It won't be easy. It requires open and honest dialogue, a willingness to compromise, and a commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone. Perhaps there are ways to modify the project to minimize the noise impact, to invest in better traffic management to protect sensitive areas of Kilvey Hill.
Right. Maybe there's a middle ground where they can still have some of the exciting elements of Skyline Swansea without completely destroying the peace and quiet that makes Kilvey Hill so special.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that economic growth and environmental protection don't have to be mutually exclusive. In fact, when done right, they can reinforce each other.
So what about just access? The developers have said that they're going to enhance access to the hill, but it seems like the locals are worried about losing their traditional routes. Can you explain that a little bit?
So Kilvey Hill has this network of paths, right? And some are official and protected by law, but there are also these informal paths and trails that people have used for generations.
So are you saying that the developers could legally shut down those informal paths, like put up a fence and be like tourists only?
It's possible, yeah. And that's a big point of contention because those routes are really a big part of how residents how they experience the hill.
So what about this new bridleway network that they're proposing?
Yeah.
Would that fix the concerns from horse riders and mountain bikers?
The details are kind of vague on that, honestly. It's not clear if these new paths are going to connect with the routes that people are already using or if they'll even be suitable for everyone who likes to use the less traveled areas of the hill.
It's like they're trying to solve a problem that no one really had.
Yeah.
So we've got noise, water, access anxieties, but what I don't get is if there's so much local pushback, how did this even get this far?
That's where things get even more interesting. Remember those 560 objections that Ben mentioned in his complaint?
Yeah, 560. That's a lot of people saying
A
no.
lot of people, exactly. And yet the council still seemed really determined to move forward with this. They even refused to hold public meetings about it.
Wow.
And this has led to this feeling that the objections weren't really given the consideration that they deserved.
So did the council just ignore what people wanted? I mean, surely that can't be right.
Well, they're saying that they followed the rules, the letter of the law when it came to public consultation. But Ben's arguing that the whole thing felt very rushed and not transparent.
Yeah, that's a little suspicious for sure.
Yeah. And then on top of that, you've got this whole issue with the open space disposal process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hold on. Let's make sure that our listeners are following us here. What is this open space disposal process?
So the land that's needed for this development is actually it's designated as public open space.
Oh, okay.
And selling it off requires this specific legal process, which also involves, you guessed it, public consultation.
So did they do that properly?
Well, at first they thought they did. They approved the land disposal in principle.
Oh, okay.
But then they got 265 objections.
265.
Compared to just 2 messages of support. Later on, they admitted that there were errors in the process, and now they have to do it again.
So they basically tried to push through this land sale without really thinking about what people thought.
Yes. Just like they did with the planning application.
That seems to be the case.
Yeah.
And it raises a lot of questions about how committed the council was to transparency and whether they were really listening to what the community was saying.
It almost feels like they had their minds made up before they even heard from the residents. Is there anything to support that? Is there evidence?
Actually, there is. Remember those speeches from the council leader praising all the economic benefits? He was saying all this way before the planning committee even met. And that's not all. The council leader's enthusiasm, for Skyline Swansea, even before the planning committee had looked at the evidence, it's definitely raising some red flags.
That's a problem, right? Shouldn't he be impartial? Let the process play out.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the people objecting are saying that. They feel like his statements, him emphasizing all the economic benefits, it made it seem biased. Like the decision was already made before they even had a chance.
It's kind of like, the referee cheering for one of the teams before the game even starts.
Yeah. It's not really a fair playing field.
That's a great way to put it. And to make things even worse, the council had a lot of money into this project, almost £8 million as a loan.
That's risky.
It is. And then on top of that, the Welsh government had promised another £4 million.
Oh, wow.
So you can see why people are questioning how impartial this process really was with all that money and political weight already behind it.
Yeah. It's like they were so focused on the good stuff that could happen that they just forgot about the risks and the people who actually live there.
Yeah. They even said maybe they should wait to make a decision until those things were figured out.
So at least someone tried to hit the brakes, but it sounds like they were outvoted.
Yeah, unfortunately, despite their efforts, the majority voted to approve it.
Makes you wonder if those 560 objections and all that evidence even mattered.
It's easy to understand why people feel that way, but it is important to remember that the planning committee did listen to the people who were against it, and the planning officers. They did make a report that talked about the concerns. But a lot of the residents, they felt like those concerns weren't really considered in the final decision.
So it's like a difference between being heard and actually being listened to.
Exactly.
So Councillor Mandy Evans, she's the one who called the application in for the committee decision.
Oh, right. So she had a key role in this whole process.
She did, and she also spoke pretty strongly in favor of the Skyline project. She argued that it would actually help address some existing problems on the hill, like fly tipping.
So she's seeing it as a solution rather than a problem.
Right. And it's important to note that just because someone supports a project doesn't mean there was any wrongdoing. But it does add another layer to the story, doesn't it?
It does. It makes you wonder, did the council really weigh all sides of the argument, or were they predisposed to approving this development from the start?
And adding to the controversy, remember the Open Spaces Society.
Oh, yeah. They're a pretty influential group when it comes to protecting public access to land.
They are. And they filed an official objection arguing that the council's assessment of the impact on public access and open space was severely lacking.
So they felt like their concerns weren't being taken seriously.
So we've got a community that's deeply concerned about the potential negative impacts of this development, and they're questioning whether the council truly listened to their concerns and whether the planning process was actually fair and impartial. So let's get into those transcripts from the planning committee meeting. This is where things really get interesting, right?
Absolutely. These transcripts give us a fascinating look into how the counselors actually wrestled with these arguments for and against the Skyline project. And, right away you see that idea of a predetermined outcome popping up. Remember Councillor Stewart and how much he supported the development?
Yeah, that definitely raised eyebrows for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Was there anything in the meeting itself that suggested his support might have swayed things to, unduly influence the outcome?
Well, the planning officer's report that they presented at the start of the meeting, it actually addresses this whole thing about Councillor Stewart's involvement. It says that he made it clear that he was a strong supporter of the Skyline development from the very beginning, and that this created some concern, amongst the people who were objecting. They felt like the council had already made up its mind.
So basically, they were saying the council was biased.
Exactly. And the report goes on to say that Councillor Stewart, he emphasized that he wouldn't try to influence the committee's decision and that all the members were free to make up their own minds based on the evidence presented.
But even if we assume everyone had good intentions, that appearance of bias can be really damaging, right?
Absolutely. It undermines the public's trust in the whole process. And it makes people feel like the decision was made behind closed doors without really considering what the community wants.
Right. And remember, this is happening against a backdrop of hundreds of objections from people who really want to protect Kilvey Hill.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the number of objections, it was the content. These weren't just casual complaints. These were really well thought out arguments about all the ways this development could negatively impact the hill. Well, they let a few residents speak directly to the committee, and they did bring up all those key concerns. Several councilors really pressed the developers on their plans for mitigating the noise, especially the fact that the gondola was going to run until midnight. And they also questioned whether the proposed traffic management would really be enough to handle all the extra visitors.
So it sounds like there was some pushback, at least on some of the specifics.
Yeah, but it's important to note that the overall tone of the meeting seemed to be leaning towards approval.
So do you think that feeling of predetermination was still there, even in how the counselors were asking their questions?
Well, there were definitely times where that sentiment seemed to come through. For example, several counselors talked about how much they supported the idea of the development in principle. They
Sure.
kept saying that Swansea needed more investment and jobs.
Yeah, that's that classic struggle, isn't it? Trying to balance economic development with protecting the environment and keeping the community happy. It sounds like in this case, the economic arguments were given a lot of weight.
They were The counselors seemed to really believe that this Skyline project was going to be a big part of Swansea's regeneration, and they were willing to accept some level of risk to get those economic benefits.
But even with all those measures in place, weren't there still some major concerns that couldn't really be addressed, like how big this development is and how it would change the look of Kilvey Hill?
Absolutely. And that's where the two dissenting votes on the committee are really interesting.
Ah, yes, the voices of dissent. Tell me more about what they had to say.
Well, they argued that the development was just too large and intrusive for a place like Kilvey Hill. It's a sensitive site. And they didn't think those mitigation measures would be enough. They also questioned whether the project would even be financially viable in the long term. They thought it might end up costing the city a lot of money if it didn't live up to the hype.
So they were saying that the potential downsides outweighed the potential benefits, that the council was making a risky bet.
Exactly. And their arguments really highlight an important point. There were some legitimate concerns raised during this meeting, concerns that weren't really addressed, at least not to the satisfaction of those two
It
counselors.
sounds like even though the majority voted in favor,
Definitely. And that unease was made even worse by the fact that a lot of crucial details, things like the final lighting scheme, the exact routes for the bridleways, even the detailed plan for mitigating noise, all those things were left as reserved matters to be figured out later.
wait, so they basically said, yeah, we approve this project, but we'll figure out all the tricky stuff later. That seems like a lot of trust to put in the developer, especially after all the distrust we've seen from the community.
If these details aren't going to be discussed and debated in public, how can people be sure that their concerns are being addressed?
That's a good point. It almost sends the message that, well, we already approved the project, so why bother arguing about the details now? So here we have a divided committee, a concerned community, and a decision that's been made, but with a lot of important details still up in the air. So what happens now? What does this mean for Kilvey Hill? Is it a done deal, or can people still challenge this decision?
Well, as of the meeting, they hadn't been told to pause the project, even though the Welsh government might step in and take a closer look. So right now, it seems like things are moving forward.
Hmm.
But even if they do approve it, there are still battles to be fought.
Like, what else can they do?
Well, think about that £30,000 contribution for the bridleways. They haven't decided exactly what that's going to look like yet. Will those new trails really make up for losing access to the old ones? Will they fit in with the character of Kilby Hill? These are all questions that the campaigners are going to be asking. And you can bet they'll be watching those plans very carefully.
Doesn't this development go against what Swansea's trying to be in the long run?
That's the heart of it, isn't it? So after all that back and forth, all those impassioned pleas, the meticulous arguments, what happened? Did the planning committee side with the community or with, this promise of a revitalized Swansea?
Well, despite the huge wave of objections and the calls for deferral, the planning committee ultimately voted to approve the Skyline Swansea application.
Right.
Yeah, there were a few dissenting voices,
Okay.
but the majority ruled in favor of the development.
Wow. So even after all that, even with the procedural concerns, and the call-in request still looming, the project still got the green light, it seems like the community's efforts, I mean, they were just in vain.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Remember, the call-in request, it throws a wrench into the whole approval process.
Right. Yeah.
It elevates this entire controversy to the national level,
Mhm.
inviting scrutiny from those Welsh ministers.
Right.
So this means the project's fate, it's no longer just in the hands of the local council.
So it's a waiting game now. Everyone's holding their breath, wondering if the Welsh ministers will, step in and really hit the pause button on this whole roller coaster ride.
Exactly. The call-in request, it acts like this legal timeout,
Hmm.
a chance for a higher authority to review the play, so to speak.
I like that.
They'll carefully examine the evidence, the procedural concerns, those environmental risks,
Right.
and ultimately they'll decide whether the local council's decision, was sound.
So what are the possible outcomes here? I mean, is the project, is it on hold? Could it be scrapped altogether? Cool.
You want to talk about the judicial review path?
Okay, let's unpack that a bit.
After the Welsh Government makes a decision.
Either way, there's still a possibility of judicial review.
This is where someone challenges the legality.
They're arguing that the decision was unlawful.
They go far beyond the slopes of Kilvey Hill.
It's a good reminder that development, it isn't just about concrete and steel and these flashy attractions.
Right.
It's about people, their livelihoods, their values, their connection to the land.
Exactly. Finding that sweet spot where progress and preservation can coexist.
Yeah.
It's a challenge that requires really thoughtful deliberation, open dialogue, and a deep understanding of all those complexities. This case, it really highlights the importance of community engagement and transparency.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Skyline Swansea debate, we're left with a lot to ponder. What does this case tell us about the power of community action? How can we ensure that development projects are truly in the best interest of the communities they impact?
Those are great questions, one's worth considering. And this deep dive has given you all the information and the insights you need to really form your own opinions. And maybe even, get involved in shaping the future of development projects in your own area.
That's a great point. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We encourage you to keep exploring these themes, stay informed about the developments in Swansea, and, remember, your voice really does matter. Until next time.